This is Delegate Brian Crosby from St. Mary's County, the Mother County, and you're listening to the Conduit Street Podcast, the best source of information on what's happening in Annapolis.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Canale here with Michael Sanderson. Michael, we are still in quarantine. We're still social distancing. How are you holding up this week?
I feel like I'm doing okay. We're sort of figuring out a pattern and a rhythm to what days can be like. So, all right, I can make do. How about you?
I'm holding up okay. It's always good to see the Mako team when we do our staff meetings via Zoom now. I think that definitely brightens up the week for everybody and brings everybody at least a feeling of being back in the office. Holding up so far. As a reminder to everybody, we are still practicing social distancing. So if the audio is not sounding as professional as it should, we do apologize, but we're doing the best we can. On today's episode, this is a special episode. We're going to talk about the budget year ahead, just in general. We're going to talk about Maryland's Rainy Day Fund, or the Revenue Stabilization Fund, and we're going to talk about a specific trigger provision that is in the Kerwin Blueprint legislation. And Michael, we have a special guest today to walk us through this, a true expert on all of these areas.
Yeah, it's a good opportunity for us. David Juppe is a name that Annapolis insiders have known for a long time as one of those go-to people who knows all the inner workings of the budget and budget process. He's worked for the Department of Legislative Services for a number of years. He and I were colleagues back in the Legislative Staff Agency some time ago and have known each other professionally for a really long time. He and I have made joint presentations to different groups over the years, so we've sort of done a frickin' frack show from time to time. He also is an instructor at the University of Baltimore at the School of Public Policy, and has done a lot of work in both professionally and academically in the areas we wanted to talk about at this time of the budget year, while the state is sort of putting the pieces together on a tricky budget, and the counties are just starting to do that. So happy to have you with us, Dr. David Juppe.
Thank you, Michael. As you mentioned, if there's a topic that makes people's eyes glaze over, I usually know something about it.
Well, that's our strong suit on this podcast. We are willing to get a little bit into the weeds and actually talk some numbers and break some stuff down. And okay, maybe it's not for everybody, but it's kind of our brand. So actually, welcome aboard, saddle up, man. You found the right place. It's a home here. Yeah.
And David, you actually have experience with podcasting, right? When you were at the Department of Legislative Services, I know you helped launch that podcast.
Yes, we did that for a couple of years, exactly. We got it's harder than there's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes than you realize.
Yes, that's very, very true. So, David, we've talked a lot on this podcast, especially recently, about the impact of COVID-19, this public health crisis, on policy and fiscal issues. And it's certainly clear that the current crisis is going to affect almost everything in terms of the state's meaningful sources of revenue. And last Friday, we heard the comptroller, Peter Francho, estimate that for fiscal 20, which is the current year we're in, which ends on June 30th, the fiscal year, that revenues are expected to plummet by $2.8 billion as a result of this pandemic. And again, that's just for the current fiscal year. So with that in mind, I want to get your perspective on the budget year ahead, fiscal 2021. We know the General Assembly just passed a budget, but David, as we go into fiscal 21, I know you've been watching this closely. I mean, what do you think we're looking at in terms of how the state can respond and what it means for both state and local governments?
There's a lot of unknowns here. So what we don't know is how long will the crisis continue? When we get to a point where the number of new cases stabilizes and the curve flattens, then what happens? Do we start returning to some period of normalcy? And how quickly does that take place? I mean, they could stretch out over months. We could get into a situation where the cases drop, but then there's only a limited return or limited backing off of social distancing. When does business get back to normal? When does society get back to normal? And do we get back into situations where they have got to do some more testing, lock things down, go back to social distancing? Is there a second wave in the fall? So there's just a lot of unknowns, and when we get back to what would be considered normal. So that's the first problem. So what's the timing of it? Because if it's a short-term issue, that's handled differently than if it's a longer-term issue.
Yeah. And I guess what lies in the background of all this is an entirely extra layer of fiscal uncertainty because it's driven by a non-fiscal issue, right? I mean, this is a public health challenge which has its own uncertainty. We don't know what the tail is going to be of cases and of severe cases and so forth. We don't know how long we're going to have, essentially like the social distancing orders are going to continue. So, an economist who's used to throwing grass in the air based on what we see in payroll reports and unemployment claims and these sort of economic indicators, now you have an entirely extra wave of uncertainty where who knows, if there's going to be a second wave of cases in rural parts of Maryland or across our region and so forth. All those things add to the uncertainty on beyond the fiscal uncertainty itself.
Right. So what complicates it is that there's an ebb and flow. There's normal structural events that occur throughout the year for building the budget, estimating revenues, re-estimating revenues, making adjustments to the budget. And every year it goes through these sort of cycles of passing the budget, spending the money, going through a period of closeout where the fiscal year ends, you account for the funds, and then kind of seeing where you are and then getting ready for the next year's cycle. So this interrupts that whole cycle.
It's kind of obvious. We're recording on April 14th, and tomorrow is what would have ordinarily been tax day. And I have to imagine that sort of the tying up of last year's income tax returns for tax year 2019, some of that's in April, some of that's later in the year, but psychologically, we think of the middle of April as the window where we start putting those pieces together. That's even been delayed. So just getting the data on last year is also going to be a missing piece for the forecast. It's a tough time to be in the crystal ball business.
Well, and even for the current fiscal year, because if the income tax deadline's been pushed out to July 15th, then you don't really have a sense of where's your fiscal year going to end.
Right. And I think all of that plays into what we're dealing with and looking at now. And David, for the states, primarily, the state now is getting hammered on income tax and sales tax, right? That's really what is going to be the bulk of the losses in state revenue. Is that the way you see it as we move forward? And, again, everything depends on how long this lasts, but nobody's out there buying TVs or washing machines right now. The stuff they are buying is generally not subject to the sales tax, right? So groceries, prescriptions, things like that. So the state really getting hammered on those two sources.
Right, exactly. As you said, those are sources that are suffering right now. No one's talking about, and that's on the general fund side, no one's talking so much right now about also the transportation trust fund because gas tax and handling tax revenues are down. So this would be the perfect time to do all those road construction projects, right? No one's driving, but the revenues are falling there too.
Casinos are shut down, so we don't have the revenue there either.
And that actually has a double whammy because the formulas require the state to make up the shortfall with general funds.
Right. We've guaranteed a specific dollar amount there as opposed to a share of the revenues. That's right.
Right. That's very interesting. And, David, we've heard the governor recently come out and talk about, instituting a hiring and a spending freeze. The governor has signaled that he's unlikely to sign any legislation that was passed in the 2020 session that has a fiscal note. All of that to me seems like the governor understands, and I'm sure legislative leadership as well, that we do need to buckle down. I know that a lot of economists are predicting this to lead into could be a prolonged recession at this point. So, I mean, it just seems like the perfect storm is brewing for the next year's budget for 21 that they just passed. What kind of actions can the governor and the General Assembly take to sort of claw back some of that money, if at all?
Right. So in the short term, while the legislature is not in session, and in this period from now until next January, unless there's a special session, But during this period, the governor can reduce up to 25% of spending through the Board of Public Works, which is a body made up of the comptroller, the treasurer, and the governor. Generally meets every 2 weeks. And they can reduce up to 25% of spending with certain exceptions. K through 12 educational programs can't be reduced, debt service, and there's some other small exceptions. Very likely that similar to what we saw after the 2008 Great Recession, there were several rounds of visits to the Board of Public Works to reduce spending. They won't really know, I think, good information until the fiscal year has ended and they see that data at the end of August. And then we get our next sense of what the revenue estimates will look like officially in September. So, right. So there could be Board of Public Works reductions. There could be hiring freezes. There could be furloughs. And then even something as significant as a special session where they have to meet to address more significant measures.
The General Assembly putting its finishing touches on the fiscal plan for this year set up this provision for $100 million transfer in case we needed extra money to respond to the coronavirus. $100 million was that's a meaningful commitment. That takes some doing for the General Assembly to find $100 million cushion. And where we sit today, $100 million toward this seems like an adorable little trifle compared to what we're actually dealing with.
Right. And we've heard Governor Hogan, as the chair of the National Governors Association, asking Congress for $500 billion to help states balance their budgets and fill these holes. Obviously, states and counties and municipalities are not only spending money to deal with this crisis, but as we've been mentioning, the revenues aren't coming in. So it is a double whammy when you look at it that way. So yeah, $100 million, of course, to people like us, that's a ton of money. But when you look at this in terms of the state's budget and the state's response to COVID-19, certainly seems like a drop in the bucket at this point.
And if you think of our usual back of the napkin, is Maryland is in the ballpark of 2% of the United States population. So if they really were to come together with a package including $500 billion in assistance for state and local governments, that's in the neighborhood of $10 billion to help the state of Maryland. I mean, we've had the federal government target a program or juice up a particular thing here or there. Even the stimulus, the ARRA money from a few years ago was a stimulus package. $10 billion is absolutely unheard of in the fiscal to state and local relationship. A one-of-a-kind consideration.
Right. So that sort of, I think, highlights what we're actually dealing with. And, this is a really, really bad situation for states across the country and for local governments across the country, certainly in dire need of those funds. And Michael and David, at the end of session, you mentioned, the General Assembly obviously adjourned early. They were finishing touches on a lot of legislation. Michael, you were following the Kirwan Commission. Again, we talk about this a lot on this podcast. At the end, there was a trigger mechanism added. I want you to sort of set the stage here, and we'll ask David for his opinion on whether or not he thinks this might be in play. But you wrote an article on the Conduit Street blog. We will link that to the show notes. But let's get into what happened there and how all of a sudden this seems like it could really be significant in terms of the recommendations and the spending for the Kirwan Commission on its Excellence in Education, the Blueprint Bill.
And thanks, Kevin. And I think to set the table here a little bit, I think listeners of this podcast are familiar with the Kirwan legislation. This was the big landmark effort to really ramp up the state and local commitment to public schools over a number of years in a number of different ways, a variety of formulas and so forth. And we knew there was a political debate about this as well as the policy debate. One element of the political debate was some skeptical policymakers basically saying, I'm not sure we should commit to this big, expensive plan. We already are sitting on a forecast for a fiscal, sort of a structural deficit, and that's without the potential of a recession. And if you bring in your forecaster from Moody's or one of these outfits, they'll typically tell you, you should be thinking that a recession is not too far away. We've had an upcycle for the economy for a pretty long time, so a recession could really turn things upside down. I'm not sure anybody was necessarily thinking of something of the magnitude of the coronavirus and what it's done to our immediate economy, but sensitivity to fiscal forecasts was one of the issues in play. So when the bill got to the Maryland Senate and there was a second round of substantive debate in an effort to round up a majority, consensus, supermajority in favor of the bill, the Senate added a clause and then actually went back and refined the clause to basically say we ought to have some sort of a trigger in this bill that in a given year, if the fiscal picture looks terrible, then maybe that year's increment of the plan won't kick in. And like, to use lay terms, that was pretty appealing to a fair number of legislators. And I think it's fair to say that this component in the bill probably added to the roster of senators who were willing at the end of the line to vote for the bill, particularly Republican senators. Multiple Republicans voted for the bill in the Senate. I think this trigger was part of it. And now I think it's very timely to look at it. It's literally, I don't know, 6 or 7 sentences. It's 150 words or so, but it's basically one clause in this bill that seems like it's really relevant because the structure of it seems like it's going to look at this year right away.
Right. And we had talked previously about the potential for some sort of a trigger, to appease maybe some of the folks who were skeptical of the fiscal implications of the blueprint bill. We didn't know what it exactly would look like, but you mentioned, Michael, it's 150 words or so. What's the main idea behind it, and why, as you've mentioned and we've mentioned, do we think it may be in play?
General gist here, and this is part of the reason we wanted to have Dave Juppe on the pod with us this week, is to kind of walk through how this works. I mean, he's been on the ground floor for so many years with the Department of Legislative Services, either as the author or the interpreter of sort of documents like this and clauses like this, that he can help us get through it. It's a little bit rough going, but in short, the language seems to say, take 2 snapshots. The official state revenue estimate comes from the Board of Revenue Estimates. We've made mention of them. They convene every so often, and they meet each December to sort of set a revenue forecast that the governor builds his proposed budget around. They reconvene in March as the legislative session is typically winding down, and we make sure the budget is balanced to the latest round of numbers. So December and March are 2 times when they typically sit down and meet. This clause in the Kerwin bill basically says, if December looks way worse than March, then that's our indicator that the trigger has been switched and it's time to take a year off on this big spending plan. Now, I'm putting that in lay terms, but the technical wording is pretty important here, because here we are in calendar 2020. I don't know what the snapshot for the fiscal future might look like come December of 2020, but back in this past March, there was so much uncertainty about what the economic impacts of the health crisis might be. The board didn't make any downward changes in March. So
right.
It seems like this issue is before us maybe sooner than anybody might have expected. And what that means for next year's budget or for the full multi-year plan, I think is worth trying to talk through a little bit today.
Yeah, and David, this is exactly why we have somebody like you on this podcast. I mean, you've read the bill, you've read this amendment and what it says. We didn't get an estimate in March because there was so much uncertainty. They decided not to revise the estimates. We did hear the comptroller come out and talk about what he thinks is going to happen for this fiscal year. But David, what is your read here and the amount of revenue that the state is going to lose, this actually coming into effect this year and then obviously in years to come?
There's 2 issues. One is, the magnitude of the potential revenue loss. Would it be more than 7.5%? And, it seems like it could be, but we won't know until we see the next round of estimates and get more information. The larger issue for me is there's a technical issue here. And one thing that Michael didn't mention was that the bill is talking about the fiscal 2022 general fund revenue estimate, which would be he referenced a December estimate the board will be coming out with in December of 2020. And it compares that to the estimate of the same year from March, which is the March 2020 estimate. The technical problem is the March 2020 estimate for the Board of Revenue Estimates doesn't include an estimate for fiscal 2022. So you can't really compare the 2022 estimate in December to the 2022 estimate in March because there is no 2022 estimate in March. That actually doesn't show up until the Board of Revenue Estimates September 2020 estimate. So there's no basis for comparison to determine if the trigger actually goes into effect.
So does this end up being a case where, okay, this amendment may have been, typed up and put through kind of, quickly. Do you end up with sort of we have to interpret it the way that makes the most sense, and referencing a set of numbers that literally doesn't exist can't be what we really meant, so we'll do a variation on the theme as the most reasonable interpretation of what's in the statute? How much latitude do you have in that circumstance? With that, that's a pretty big technical issue.
Unless the law has changed, I don't really see how you can interpret this to mean, well, really, let's look at the September estimate, or let's look at our estimate of fiscal 2022 outside of the Board of Revenue Estimates. Maybe look at what DLS estimated. I don't know that you can really do that.
Okay, so we've got a technical issue that the difference between sort of my explanation in lay terms and that very comparable explanation that happened on the floor of the Senate. I remember listening to the leaders of the fiscal committee explain to other senators, here's how this is going to work, and this should make you feel more comfortable about the bill. If the technical drafting doesn't match the general gist, you've got a real problem there. In the event that there's some way to get over that hurdle, I guess there's also another question. If we end up with a significant loss of own source revenues, like the income tax is going to be really down and the sales tax is going to be really down, but some of that revenue would be made up through funds coming from the CARES Act or whatever the next thing that might come from the U.S. Congress. If we end up getting some sort of grants from the federal government to make the state maybe not whole, but partially whole, or to mitigate some of these losses, is that a matter of, would that show up in the federal, in the general fund revenue forecast as an easy enough dollar for dollar swap where we wouldn't have an apples and oranges problem here?
No, it doesn't work that way. So the federal funds are going to be apart and separate from the general fund. And not to digress too badly, but just a quick mention, one of the difficulties with the federal legislation that was just recently passed at the end of March is that it doesn't give the states a lot of flexibility in how those funds are used. They can use them to address new expenses that are above and beyond the most recently enacted budget, but they don't help the states where they need it most, which is to make up for the shortfall in revenue.
That is something, Michael, we've been talking about the National Association of Counties to address that issue, right? Where the states need help to fill the holes that are being left by, no revenue coming in, especially income and sales tax. Hopefully the next round of federal funding will allow states to use that federal money, not just to respond to the pandemic for eligible costs that they're expending to respond, but also to backfill the lost revenue that isn't coming in.
Yeah, we don't know what Washington's going to do, but I think they're hearing that message loud and clear from, Governor Hogan happens to be the lead of the National Governors Association, but that's been a bipartisan message from state leaders and county leaders across the state, the same thing, that round one, appreciate the gesture, but this was too narrow in a lot of ways. Also, put in a plug for distribution direct to local governments rather than through the state is a long-standing priority for local governments as well. So anyway, some work to do on an additional round there, but I appreciate the clarification, Dave, that the state's own calculation here, even if there's some sort of federal funds that might end up making the state kind of whole, they've defined themselves so rigidly in this amendment that the before and after wouldn't include the make whole funds. Another technical problem there. So it seems to me, David, if you can help us walk through this, but this trigger provision is basically saying if the state's picture of general fund revenues drops by 7.5%, pretty big drop, if that drops by 7.5% between point A and point B, and we know there's some technical problems with measuring that, but assuming that gets ironed out, then
Right.
What I'm interested in is, okay, we have a conventional recession and we have 1 year where we hit the trigger and then things are sluggish afterward. What does year 2 look like under this trigger mechanism? Does Kerwin stay on pause if the economy does?
What happens is if you see a reduction of 7.5%, you have 1 year where the formulas are constrained by the rate of inflation for the per pupil amounts and the rest of the formula. Then in the next year, unless that same set of circumstances occurs where you have another large reduction in revenue of 7.5%, the formulas go back to normal. So I think, as I read it, you just kind of bounce back to get back on track, and then you go from there.
So you'd have to fall off a second cliff, right, Michael? I mean, that's essentially what we're talking about here. And the problem is these are dollar amounts written into the legislation, right? So it's not just a growth off of a number from the previous year. It's a dollar amount. So even if, you were down by 9%, 2 years later, you're still there, but you haven't fallen off another cliff. These provisions in the bill, the dollar amounts go right back into effect, and you'd have to fall off another cliff in order for the trigger to remain in place.
This is probably a one-of-a-kind thing we're facing right now. But what we're looking like in calendar 21, who knows, or calendar 26, who knows? I just think those are interesting questions. At the one sentence level, this sounds really appealing, right? The economy falls apart. We'll take a break on this funding program. Oh, okay. I think that sounds pretty good, responsible. But in the details, it's almost like, we have an economy that falls apart and stays there. And on year 2, it's the horses are riding again. Everything's fine. And that may not be where the economy or the revenues really are. So anyway, this is fraught with devil in the details kind of stuff. Even as the General Assembly wanted to make this bill more palatable on a sort of, fiscal responsibility axis.
We'll take a break there. When we come back, we're going to get into the state's rainy day fund, and we'll pick David's brain on the rainy day fund and how he sees this pandemic affecting the rainy day fund. All that and more after the break.
Hi, this is Brian Griffiths, the founder of Maryland Podcast Month. Maryland Podcast Month was founded in 2018 to draw attention to all of the great podcasts and podcasters here in Maryland. And during this time of social distancing, there is no better time to start learning more about locally produced podcasts. Shows like my podcast, Red Maryland Radio, Eye on Annapolis, the Conduit Street Podcast, JB's Drive-In Podcast, the Maryland Crabs, Quality Time, the Society Fringe Players, and more are still putting out fresh content. Visit MarylandPodcastMonth.com to learn more about these great Maryland podcasts. That's MarylandPodcastMonth.com. And we thank you for your support of local content.
Welcome back to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Canale back here with Michael Sanderson and David Juppe. David and Michael, let's talk about the Revenue Stabilization Account, or the Rainy Day Fund. We mentioned on the front half that the General Assembly in the fiscal 21 budget authorized the governor to transfer up to $100 million from the Rainy Day Fund for COVID-19 related response efforts. And we know the Rainy Day Fund has about $1.2 billion in it right now, which is around 6.25%. And we mentioned that's a drop in the bucket in terms of what this is going to cost the state and, of course, local governments and how we address this pandemic. I want to talk about what is available to the governor. We are in a state of emergency, so that does make things more interesting. But let's talk about the Rainy Day Fund, why it's there in the first place, and then what we think moving forward is going to happen in terms of how much money we actually use from the Rainy Day Fund to address this pandemic.
The Rainy Day Fund, as I like to explain to my students in my budget class, is just like having a savings account. It's money that you set aside for use when things go bad. Say you lose your job, you have a reduction in salary, what have you, and it's money that's there to help you sort of weather the storm until the ship is right again. You mentioned just briefly that the state had set aside $1.2 billion, which is about 6% of estimated general fund revenues. I think the number's actually somewhat lower than that already. You did reference there was budget reconciliation legislation that authorized the governor to use $100 million of that balance for the coronavirus. Chapter 12 also authorized the governor to use another $50 million. And there was a recent announcement where the governor has taken another $137 million out of the fund to use for various small business programs under the Department of Commerce and Department of Labor. So I'm guessing right now that the balance is somewhere just short of $1 billion. So maybe closer to about 5%, maybe a little less than 5%. So there is that balance, and normally accessing the balance below 5% would require legislation. And but as you know, the governor declared a state of emergency, and under that allows the governor to suspend existing law for a 30-day period. So he actually has access to the full roughly $1 billion right now to use and take it out of the savings account and put it into the general fund to help cover this projected loss of revenue.
So the governor now has access to the entire account, and we know the state, the goal is to maintain 10% of estimated general fund revenues in each fiscal year. That doesn't generally happen. In your mind, David, I mean, when it comes to rainy day funds, and obviously we're in a crisis, the governor can drain the account if he needed to, but generally, outside of a crisis, in your mind, how much is enough when it comes to rainy day funds for states? I think it's a question that is often asked. There's a lot of opinions on this, but in your mind, if we weren't dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and we weren't thinking right now about potentially having to really significantly dip into it, how much is enough?
This actually, you can't avoid discussion of what's the intended use of a rainy day fund, a savings account, basically. I don't think there's any way for me to get around this, but you have to sort of talk about this idea of pro-cyclical versus counter-cyclical budget measures. So when you have a situation where you go through the business cycle, it goes through its ups and downs, the business cycle turns downward, you have a loss of revenue, and how do you address that? The typical things that people think about for budgets are you either have to raise more taxes or you cut spending or you do some combination of the two. Those are, from the standpoint of budget theory, those are considered pro-cyclical actions. They actually make the recession worse because you're cutting spending, you're laying people off, there's less money coming out of the government. And these are actions that are really not the best way to address trying to get through this recession. Governments also have a situation where as people lose their jobs, they suddenly qualify now for entitlement programs. So not only does government lose revenue, but it also has additional spending because you now have more people who qualify for Medicaid and food stamps and temporary cash assistance. So government gets pulled in both directions where it loses revenue and has to spend more money. So the last thing you want to do is lay more people off from the government roles and cut back spending that would have gone to businesses. So this second issue, or the second theory of addressing the downturn, is to try to use counter-cyclical measures. And those include things like using the rainy day fund, getting assistance from the federal government, using general fund balance. So these don't make a recession worse because they're almost considered temporizing actions. You're using available resources without having to make the recession more difficult to get through. So there's a lot of thought and theory about how much you should have in reserve. And some entities, like the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities is one entity that has come out with various papers over the years, which suggests that you should have enough money in reserve so that you don't have to raise taxes or make any reductions at any point in time, and just entirely rely on counter-cyclical measures.
The theory being, when times are good, don't go out and spend up to those levels where the revenues are high. Put a whole bunch in the sock so that when times are bad, you don't have to do all these austerity measures and big cutbacks and tax increases and so forth. Like, smooth the whole thing out.
Right, but you have to have like 15 or 20 or 30% in reserve to do that.
Right. This isn't singling out Maryland. It's not like we're a particularly bad actor here, but that's a level of political foresight that, I don't know. I don't know if there's anybody out there who's sitting on a 20% reserve fund with this kind of strategy in mind.
Right, and that's the difficulty is that when you have a downturn, you lose revenue, and then your revenue doesn't immediately bounce back. It lasts a couple of years. After the 2008 recession, it actually took 5 years before revenues got back to 2008 levels. So it's probably not practical to have a balance of that magnitude. You have to have a lot of political will, and I can tell you that every time Maryland has attempted to build its balances higher, there's a lot of interest in spending that. My former budget director, Warren Deschanel, OPA director, executive director, used to have a saying that nature abhors a fund balance. And that's one of those immutable laws that it's just timeless because it's always true. So it's very hard politically.
Right. And imagine when you're saying, sorry, we need to leave all these poor kids on the waiting list for developmental disability administration services, or the state employees are going to have to go another year without getting a salary increase because we need to keep, $3.5 billion lying in a sock because one day the economy is going to turn down and we don't want to have to tighten our belt then. There's a lot of people feeling like, hey, my belt's tight right now.
Right. It's politically very, very difficult to make that sell to your constituents. Obviously, you want to get reelected. You want to do good things. So to look at all that money, put it in the sock is really difficult to do. And I guess, David, I like the theories that you're mentioning and how much you should really have to implement those strategies. But, I guess there's another question here. When you look at a rainy day fund, and, obviously you're not going to have 15-30%, but does it really matter as a measure of fiscal responsibility? I know that Maryland usually is hovering around 5 to 6%. Obviously we'd like to be at 10, but does that gap between 10 and 6 really matter in terms of how you should be considered when you look at fiscal responsibility?
So this again sort of ties into the rest of the answer, I guess, for how much do you need to have in reserve? Because my view, my personal opinion view here is that you're not going to have enough to carry you through a recession and a recovery. And so the purpose, I believe, of a rainy day fund is to it buys you some time. It addresses the immediate shortfall, and it gives you some time to make some decisions about what other actions you're going to adopt to get through the crisis and then get back to sort of fiscal stability. So the bond rating agencies have there's always a rumor that they wanted 5% in reserve. And this seems to have come from a 1970s quote from Robert Mueller, who was the vice president for Standard & Poor's, who was asked what, would be a good amount for states to have in reserve. And he said, well, 5% seems like kind of a good number, as long as don't have too much revenue volatility. And so, states kind of got this 5% number in their minds. And, it's kind of interesting because Maryland created this rainy day fund in 1986 and started with a fund balance of 2%. And after the 1991 recession, that amount was used entirely to help balance the budget. And then in 1996, the requirement was raised to 5%. And then after the 2001 and 2008 recessions, Maryland became very conservative about using that money because there was a fear of losing the AAA bond rating that Maryland gets from the bond rating agencies when it issues debt. And nobody wanted to be the one who would lose the state's AAA bond rating. So suddenly that 5% became almost like a work of art that you would admire. No one would use it. And the fund balance was never used. Instead, everything else was used. Gap reserves, local income tax reserve account, program open space, workers' compensation, unfunded liabilities, anywhere there was money was used as if it was a rainy day fund. And instead, we still had that 5% just sitting there because of that, that fear. But as we saw, there were other states with AAA bond ratings like Georgia and North Carolina and Virginia that used almost their entire fund balances after the 2008 recession, and they didn't lose their bond rating. In terms of just what is the right amount, a really interesting article came out in 2001 by Philip Joyce, who's now the one of the deans at the University of Maryland College Park, and this is the public budgeting and finance. And he suggested that every state look at how much elasticity is evident in each of their revenues that make up their general fund. And so, if you're very reliant on the income and sales tax, you're going to have more volatility than a government that's very reliant on the property tax. Or conversely, if you're very reliant on corporate income taxes, there's a lot of volatility there, a lot of elasticity. And so that should be really the measure that you use to guide how much you have in reserve.
So I think that's interesting, David. You mentioned the sort of work of art comment, but I think that's what a lot of Annapolis policy stakeholders have their takeaway is that we sit on a rainy day fund, but we've decided it never rains. So you're exactly right. We've seen lots of budgets that have found creative ways to find $200 million here and $75 million there from various funds and transfers and program delays and other things like that. And largely doing that to avoid having to touch the fund that theoretically is there to solve small fiscal issues. So it's a curiosity that we've allowed to build up in the name of we are super fiscally responsible, and Standard & Poor's loves that, so they rate our bonds high, we pay low interest, and that's good government. And it's tough to argue with any link in that chain, but you do end up with some kind of weird outcomes.
Yeah, because the weird thing to me is Maryland used its balance before in the 1990s, and now it's untouchable.
So, David, is this, though, the time when, in your opinion, is this where you dip in and you significantly dip into the rainy day fund? Is this the pandemic, this crisis? Is this actually going to turn the tide in terms of Maryland is now going to realize that it is raining and it's time to dip into this money that we have in the SOC for a reason just like this? Do you think this is the time? Maybe not drain the whole thing, but do you expect that there's going to be a significant chunk of the rainy day fund access to address this pandemic?
Well, absolutely, it has to be, because if the Board of Revenue Estimates is right, even if they're half right, and you lose, $1.4 billion in revenue, that's not something that the state easily can address. There is some amount of expected general fund balance that can be used, but that rainy day fund really has to be accessed to carry it forward. The issue for me then becomes what happens with the repayment, because one of the things that the rating agencies are concerned about once you use the rainy day fund, they want to know, do you have a plan for trying to make sure that your budget is going to be balanced in the future, and how are you going to repay the fund? Maryland has repayment provisions in the fund that are basically 20 years old. They basically say if you use below 3%, you repay the fund at $100 million a year, and anything below 5% gets repaid at $50 million a year. It's going to take a long, long time under the current repayment structure for repayment and to replenish that balance. Whereas you look at a state like Virginia that has both a statutory and a constitutional provision relating to repayment of their rainy day fund, where at closeout they have various amounts that are automatically diverted at different levels, and if they have a more robust recovery, then they have what is called the super sinker, and even more revenue goes directly into that rainy day fund, and so it gets replenished very quickly.
Got it. Well, this is one of those topics that gets a little technical, but I think it's raining, and understanding the dynamics of why do you have this money set aside, what's the purpose in normal times, and what's the functionality in unusual times like these is awfully relevant right now. So, I'll extend our thanks for having you come join us. You're as much of an expert on reserve funds for state governments as anybody on the Eastern Seaboard, I think. So, modesty aside, we're thrilled to have you as a guest to give us a little perspective on Maryland and around us. And this has been a good compliment to our usual stick, Kevin.
I agree with you 100%. And David, I know that, let's end on a positive note. You're a Ravens season ticket holder. I've been to a football game with both of you. I know you're watching the draft. David, what do you think in terms of what the Ravens should do? Do you go with the wide receiver? Do you potentially double dip there, or do you try to shore up the linebacker position?
Well, Kevin, I have given this a lot of thought, and I know that a lot of Ravens fans are still smarting after Derrick Henry ran for 195 yards in the playoff loss in January. Obviously, you can see that the Ravens have bolstered the defensive line with some free agent acquisitions, and they feel like they have never rebounded at inside linebacker after C.J. Mosley went to the Jets. So the conventional wisdom is that they hope to either get Patrick Queen or Kenneth Murray, the linebackers from LSU and Oklahoma, respectively. But the pundits seem to think that both those linebackers will be gone before the Ravens get the pick. And so what's being floated now, which I think is absolutely false, is that they're going to take Zach Bond from Wisconsin. I don't think they're going there. I think they're just trying to mislead the public. And where I personally believe they're going is Denzel Mims from Baylor. This guy has got all the measurables: 6'3", 216, ran a 4.38 at the combine. That's the 40-yard dash. And I think they're talking of a good game about taking an inside linebacker, but I think they're going to have a plan for that. And you heard it here first. They're taking Denzel Mims from Baylor, wide receiver.
I love it. I love it.
I'm
dying for this guy. Oh, yeah.
They got the 28th overall pick. I think they should also be taking a look at a wide receiver from LSU, Justin Jefferson. The kid is a stud. I really like the idea of having Hollywood out there with another wide receiver for Lamar. This kid, I think he caught 18 touchdowns, over 1,500 yards, stud. Wow. But yeah, the Derrick Henry, that incident is obviously fresh in everybody's mind. So we'll have to wait and see. But I like you making that call. You heard it on the Conduit Street podcast.
All good.
All right, we'll go ahead and leave it there. Again, thank you so much to David Juppe. Really great insight. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe. That way, everything will be sent directly to you. You can follow along on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and of course, the Conduit Street blog. But until the next episode, Kevin Canali signing off for David and Michael, and we will talk to you soon.